The goal of this demo is to demonstrate how to deploy Onedata solution and use it. And the deployment will be done using Nuvla online service for provisioning applications on clouds. This is an architecture that the deployment architecture that we will be targeting. So initially what we need to do is to deploy Onezone service, then Oneprovider services on each of the clouds. In this demo we will use two clouds, one of them is Open Telekom and another one is Exoscale. Then we will have to attach the backends to Oneproviders, where one of them will be S3, which is part of the cloud solution on both of Open Telekom and Exoscale. So what we will have to deploy extra is to deploy the GlusterFS on each of the cloud providers and then connect them to the Oneprovider service. And then as a last step we will deploy one client on a separate virtual machine and validate that the files created in S3 or GlusterFS are visible on the client, and vice versa. Files created on the client are populated and replicated in S3 and GlusterFS. There are two ways to deploy this. One of them is application or component by component, and on this web page in the documentation you have the thorough explanation on how to deploy Onezone, how to deploy Oneprovider, and then how to deploy GlusterFS, with explanations of all the configuration parameters that are required and all the extra data which is required to be collected to populate the parameters. At the same time, it's possible to deploy everything with one button click, and this is what we will opt for now. There is a special section which describes that, a special section in the documentation. So basically this application deployment from Nuvla service will provision for us Onezone, will provision Oneprovider on OTC, and will provision Oneprovider on Exoscale. So this is what we will attempt to do now. So we follow this link here. So now I'm on the Nuvla service. I was already authenticated. That is why I didn't have to enter the username and the password to use FedID to connect to the service, but if you need to do that, this will be just an additional step before you reach this page. So we click the deploy button here. We will select that we will specify the cloud per each we will specify each component started on different clouds. So Exoscale goes to Exoscale, Oneprovider on OTC goes to Open Telekom Cloud. And it is assumed definitely that you have credentials for both of the clouds configured in your profile. So now we need a little bit of extra information for Onezone. To deploy Onezone we need to know the tenant name and the FedID token. So the necessity for those is described in the Onezone section of the documentation. So basically, to fill in the tenant name, it's a buyer tenant name as it appears in FedID service. So for me it will be SixSq. The second parameter that we need to provide is a FedID token. So to provide FedID token, we need to log in to our realm in Federated Identity Provider. I will use the master realm now. Log into it. I will select SixSq, and the steps that are required to actually create the client is the following. We go to the client registration tab and we click on create button. Then we choose the defaults, save. We copy that what we have in that field, and then we provide this as a value to the parameter. Onezone will be deployed on Exoscale. And we click the deploy button. Now we are redirected to the dashboard of the Nuvla, from where you can see all your running applications. So this is a deployment that we just started to provision. As we see, there are two orchestrators. One of them is responsible for deploying Onezone and Oneprovider on Exoscale. So this is a part of the deployment responsible for the deployment of the application on Exoscale, and this one is corresponding to the deployment of the Oneprovider on OTC. Because we know that we will require the Gluster cluster following this architecture diagram. So what we will do now, while the deployment is still provisioning for the Onedata components, we will deploy the Gluster per cloud. So we will click on the GlusterFS deployment section. So here is a link which leads to deployment of the Gluster from Nuvla. So we select deploy. So the first one will go to Exoscale. Potentially your Gluster cluster deployment should be scalable. That is why we will click a scale button. So at the moment we will accept all the defaults for the node configuration and deploy this application. So as you can see, Onedata is being deployed on two clouds, and that Gluster cluster will be deployed on on Exoscale. So now we will deploy the same cluster but on Open Telekom. Again, scalable. And deploy the application. So now we have to wait until all the applications are provisioned. So all of our three deployments were successful. They are now in ready state. Just to recap what we provisioned. So far we provisioned Onedata, which consists of a Onezone instance which we selected to be deployed at Exoscale, then one provider at Exoscale, and one provider at OTC. Also, as two separate deployments, we have a Gluster cluster on OTC and Gluster cluster at Exoscale. So to validate deployment, now we will connect to Onedata via Onezone. For that, we will go to the actual deployment. Select Onezone component and follow the link URL of Onezone. So this is a login page of Onezone. This is where you have to select the KeyCloak as an authentication method. After successfully logging in to Onedata, we will create a new space. And then, as a next step, we will be configuring Oneproviders. And on one provider, we will be connecting Oneproviders to S3 and GlusterFS. We will select Exoscale for that, and then the next step will be a provisioning of Oneclient to actually do some verification and validation of the data management on the level of user. Our next step will be the configuration of Oneprovider. So we select Oneprovider at Exoscale. This is where we have to accept the self-signed certificate. Now, to connect to Oneprovider control panel, we have to use admin as a username, and for password, we have to get it from the set of deployment parameters of the Oneprovider. This password was auto-generated. So now we see that the zone registration step was successfully completed by Oneprovider. So we know that this Oneprovider was already connected to Onezone. So the next step is a configuration of the backend storage. So this is where we would select the Gluster file system. We give it a name, Gluster Exo, for example. So for the volume name, you have to select the same volume name as it was provided when the deployment of the GlusterFS was done. So we know that at Exoscale, let me go to the dashboard. At Exoscale, for the volume name we chose data. So this is what we have to enter here. Then the volume server host is IP address of of this Gluster cluster. And documentation suggests us, let's have a look at that, the Gluster cluster deployment. It tells that after the deployment of the cluster, we should copy the value of local IP parameter, and this is where we will be using them. We have to use it for in the configuration with Oneprovider. So we have to select the local IP, which in this particular case corresponds to the public IP, but it's not always the case. And we have to paste it here. Here we keep all the defaults. Then in the configuration of Oneprovider, we have some hints on how to actually configure it. So the configuration for GlusterFS is described here. It's a GlusterFS Oneprovider on cloud. This is where it suggests that we have to select the insecure option after providing volume name and the volume server host. So insecure option is selected and then we add it. So the storage was successfully added. Now we want to support a space by this storage. And this is where we go to Onezone, and for the space that we've created, we would add a storage. So the process requires the copying of the token and using this token in the configuration of the support. Support token is the one that we've just generated, and for the size, let's give 100 megabytes. This should be plenty for the testing purposes that we are aiming at now. So what we did, we just supported the space. And to see if this provider actually connected and transmitted the information to Onezone, we need to refresh this page of Onezone. And then we see that this space is supported by the provider with this IP, which is actually our provider. So this is how the configuration of the Oneprovider backend, in this case it was Gluster backend, Gluster storage, is done. And this is how a Oneprovider with a pre-configured storage backend can support a space. S3 storage on the provider at Exoscale. So we click at add storage, we select S3. For the storage name, we name it S3 at Exoscale. So the credentials to access the S3 at Exoscale should be known to you from the configuration of the API keys at Exoscale. So for the storage, for connecting from provider to the storage, S3 storage at Exoscale, we have to select the signature version 2 at the moment and click and secure. So now we have two storages configured. One of them is S3 and another one is Gluster. So in our configuration so far we have one space which is supported by the Gluster Exo storage, which is backed by the GlusterFS. So what we will do, we will add another space. We go to Onedata. And we create another space. We call it space 2, for example. And then we request the support for this space 2. we copy the token, we go back to one panel configuration, and then we say support space. So for this particular space we will select S3 Exo as a storage backend, and we enter the token, and let's say for the size we say 100 megabytes. So now this provider supports two spaces, space 1 and space 2, and for each of them it separately supports S3 with S3 backend and with GlusterFS backend. So if we come back to Onedata, Onezone, and refresh the page, we will actually see that that indeed our provider supports two spaces, space 1 and space 2. Now, by clicking to go to your files, you will be redirected to this provider. This is what we will do now. And from that user interface of Oneprovider and the file management interface, we will try to upload some files. And then later on, check if those files are actually visible from cloud resources. So it's possible to select here the space we want to upload the files to. So we'll select the space number 1, which was our GlusterFS. We'll click at upload file. We'll select a file. So we just uploaded a PDF to space 1. We select space 2 and upload the file there as well. So now we select this test file, test.txt file, and it was successfully uploaded as well. So to validate the fact that clients started on the virtual machines can access the backends through Onezone, through Oneprovider, and manipulate with those files, we need to deploy a client. So the deployment of the client actually is described in the researchers section of the documentation under the data access. We will deploy one client on CentOS 7. There is a number of parameters that we have to provide before we can actually deploy it. So one of them is access token. So the access token can be obtained from Onezone after clicking on the data management interface and clicking on the tokens pictogram here. So this is where we would request the access token. We copy it and we paste it into this edit box of the access token parameter. Now we have to provide the provider host name. So to obtain the provider host name, we select the provider from here and click on this copy button. So the provider IP was copied, and this is a default mount point where the data backends will be mounted. We'll keep it, we'll leave the default. and I am deploying it at Exoscale. So now we have to wait until that client is up and running, and after we SSH into it, we should be able to see under MNT Onedata, we should be able to see the spaces that we requested to be supported by that provider, and also the files. Client virtual machine, the virtual machine with one client was successfully provisioned at Exoscale. So what we will do, we'll SSH into that virtual machine. Check if we have, yes, we have Onedata under the root, and we have two spaces. And in both of the spaces we have the files that were actually uploaded to the backends, to the separate backends via the data management interface of Onedata. So if we edit a file, for example, we choose so first let's check its content. So it says test file. If we, for example, echo something else into it, the date, let's validate that it was updated. So the file was updated. Now we go to Onezone. We go to our files. So we remember that the file that we were editing, it was in a space 2. This is a text file. And let's download this file. So we've downloaded the file, and let's check its content. So indeed the file contains the data that we've put into the file. So this completes the demo of the data management deployment and validation for HNSciCloud. The solution is based on Onedata, and it is automatically deployed by Nuvla service. So the full documentation can be found in the HN prototype doc website. So two sections which are related to the data management. One of them is for data coordinators and the deployment of the solution itself, the deployment of Onezone, Oneprovider, GlusterFS. So this is where we actually deployed it with one-click deployment. And for actual access to the files is for researchers and the data access subsection. That's it. Thank you very much.